talk about genetics, which is one of my favorite topics. And I am so bummed that we can't be together to take a look at this unit, but we are still going to do our best. And I think that this is really a bunch of interesting stuff because it is directly applicable to you. This is all about you and why you look the way you look and why you are the way you are to a certain extent. So, we're really going to just introduce some things today that you've gotten a chance to already look at and to kind of delve a little bit deeper. So, if you think back to this hunk of Burn and Love, look at him. Woo! What a cutie. You might kind of recognize him from the activities that we've done so far this week. This is Gregor Mendel, the monk who is considered the father of modern genetics. And if you know anything about a monk, it is just someone who's kind of like a religious scholar, like he was studying Christianity at the time. And Gregor Mendel has something directly to do with this poem. I didn't choose the skin I'm in. I didn't pick the shape of my nose or the color of my hair. Just another considered loss in this apparent genetic lottery. So, besides the obvious sadness of this poem, the other thing you can kind of ascertain from this little bout of poetry is that genes dictate your appearance, right? To a certain extent, whatever genes we have, that gives us our appearance. So if you are sitting there watching this right now, I want you to think, are you someone who's left-handed or right-handed? Can you go like this? Can you do this? Roll your tongue. Lastly, if you're gonna hold your hands together, okay, like this, what thumb is comfortably on top? Is it your left thumb? Your right thumb? Go ahead and switch it. Like move all your fingers. Doesn't that feel weird? So just see what naturally feels right to you. And if we think about the population of the United States as a whole, these are all traits that are dictated by genes, like I said, to a certain extent. And so we can kind of get a percentage based on that. About 70% of people can roll their tongue. They can do this because of a gene that they have in a certain version of that gene. About 30 cannot. 93% of people are right-handed. So the majority of us are right-handed. Now keep in mind, you can train yourself to use the other hand, yada, yada, but to some degree, genetics do have a role in your handedness. And lastly, most people like the left thumb on top, which is what I feel comfortable with. Slightly less people like the right thumb, and there's a very, very small group that says, oh, feels the same either way. So these are all traits that are have a genetic component. So that is something that we're really going to talk about in this unit is traits that are dictated by genes. So when we think about genes, we got to think, well, what are we talking about? And if you look at this is a picture of a karyotype. It's just a photo that essentially shows you all the chromosomes that we put together in pairs. And remember, we talked about homologous pairs of chromosomes. We have 23 pairs because we're humans, and this would be all 23 of them. So this is a human karyotype. If we took all of your chromosomes out of one of your cells and we lined them up, this is what this would look like. Now, if you look, there are lots of different pairs that are lots of different sizes. And then when you get to this last pair here, instead of labeled 23, the 23rd pair, we labeled it X or Y. So if this person has two X chromosomes, what are they? Are they a girl? Are they a boy? That is a female. So something like a karyotype just shows us all of our chromosomes, which, as you know, have all of your genes on them. If you look at this person's karyotype, what's different about them? They're still a girl. You can see that here. But if you look at their 21st chromosome, they have 3 instead of only the typical 2. So this is somebody who have Down syndrome. If you laid out all of their chromosomes with all of their genes, they have an extra 21st chromosome. So why are we talking about chromosomes if we're trying to talk about genetics and genes and the traits that you have? Because we kind of got to separate what we're talking about as we start this unit. Your sex chromosomes are the chromosomes that determine your sex. So if you are XX, you are biologically female. If you're XY, you are biologically male. Typically, obviously, there can be kind of variations of that. And I'm not talking about, someone being transgender or anything like that. This is just if we're talking about what XX means or XY means. So we're not actually going to get into sex chromosomes right now. When we do all of this genetic stuff, we're looking at this A vocab word down here, autosomal chromosomes. Those are all your other chromosomes. All 44 of them, because there's 46 total, are not sex chromosomes. So most of the time when we talk about Mendelian traits, we're not talking about sex-linked traits, anything to do with your sex, because there actually are not a ton of characteristics or genes, especially on that little Y chromosome. That thing is tiny. So remember, what is this picture showing us? It's just a karyotype. It's just a picture of all your chromosomes, and on each chromosome are some genes that give you guys your traits. And if you look at this person, wait a minute, look at their 23rd pair. Instead of just XX or XY, they have XXY. So think about it for a second. Do you think that's a boy? Do you think that's a female? This is actually going to be a male with something called Klinefelter syndrome. So once again, when we get into genetic disorders, if we have time, so interesting. That's going to be something related to their sex chromosomes, but you can have lots of different genetic disorders related to your autosomal chromosomes, those chromosomes that are not sex linked. So when we talk about Gregor Mendel, this good looking dude. I mean, wow. He is not someone who was cognizant of chromosomes. He didn't know what that was. He didn't know even really the term genes and DNA. This was too long ago. But he experimented with pea plants to the point where what he figured out helped create this basis of now we know, well, all of the genetics that he was looking at are on chromosomes. So he showed basic inheritance patterns by messing with those pea plants. And that's why we consider him the father of modern genetics, because he helped discover some things about heredity and how you guys inherit your traits. So Gregor Mendel was actually one of the first people to say, wait a minute, when I take a red flower and a white flower, I don't just always get a pink flower. And that's what people thought. They thought, okay, if I take a round seed and a wrinkled seed, the baby's going to be kind of mixed between round and wrinkled. And that's just not true. It's not what he found. So when he mixed together different pea plants with their flowers, he found that when you had a purple or a white parent and you put them together, their babies were either purple or white. They weren't a mix of the two. So he's one of the first people to say, now, wait a minute, things don't just automatically blend. So he looked at lots of different traits. I mean, this dude did not have a lot going on. He had a lot of free time. So he was just experimenting with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different pea plants and looked at lots of different traits. The color of the flower, the position of the flower, the seed shape, the shape of the pod, the color of the pod, the length of the stem. And he saw that essentially all of these traits were once again fitting this idea that there is no blending going on. It's either this or this. And that's what made him say, well, something else has to be going on here, because this isn't what people thought was going to happen. So here's essentially Mendel's experiment in a picture. He started with a yellow seed and a green seed. That's his parent generation. And he cross-pollinated them, meaning that he took the girl part and the boy part, and he made a baby plant with those two parents. And no matter what, if you did 10, 15, 100, 1,000 babies, all of that first generation, F1 generation, all of those babies were yellow. Every single seed was yellow. So then he said, okay, so no blending. Let me see what happens if I take those yellow babies and I make them have babies with themselves. So he did self-pollination. And then he looked at the second generation, the babies of that first generation. And he said, wait a minute. 75% of the time, the baby's going to be yellow. But 25%, 1 out of 4, is green. So how did I get from 2 yellow parents here to a green baby? So this is kind of what made him say, this pattern is always occurring. Something has to be going on. No matter what, that first generation had only yellow seeds. And no matter what, that second generation had about 3-to-1 ratio, 75% yellow, 25% green. So if you think for a second, what does that tell you about the dominant color in pea plant seeds? Based on what you saw in that first experiment, think about that as you guys answer my subsequent questions, all right? So if we look at his experiment on an even bigger ratio, because he did this, like I said, a lot. He did not have a life. He just kept doing it, and he kept seeing that 3-to-1 ratio pop up again. So even when he had those babies have babies, he saw that 3-to-1 ratio again. So he knew that something unique is happening here. Now, when he crossed green with green, he only ever got green. But he saw that 75% and said, something has to be going on. There has to be these different factors. So here's essentially his hypothesis using words that we now know are true. For each trait, you get one allele from each parent. So parent one, the mom, she has 2 alleles for the gene of freckles. She has the allele to have freckles, and then the allele to not have freckles. And parent 2, the dad, he has the same thing, the allele to have it and the allele not to have it. And they each pass one of those alleles, those versions of a trait, to their offspring. So for Mendel's example of pea plants, the flower color is the gene, and the flower could either be purple or white. So one flower is passing on the allele to be purple or white, and the other flower is passing on the allele to be purple or white. So that version of a gene is something that you get from your parent. So essentially, when 2 different alleles are present, we know that one is going to be dominant, and that's the one that you're going to see, and one is going to be recessive, and that's the one that's hidden. So then how does this work? How do you only actually get one of those alleles? Well, think about what we talked about with meiosis. When we do meiosis, we're splitting the genetic material, the DNA, so that each egg or each sperm only gets 23 chromosomes. So essentially, all of our gametes only gets one allele from our mother or our father. Now, it doesn't always have to be that your mother had recessive and dominant, or your father had recessive and dominant. It could be totally random and totally different. But no matter what, that egg or that sperm only gets one allele from each parent, and that's going to be what's passed on to our offspring. So putting together all of Mendel's experiments and all of the results that he got, he basically came up with some ideas that we now call Mendel's laws. He said, firstly, there are going to be 2 alleles for a trait, and those 2 alleles separate when you make gametes. When we do meiosis, which we already did this. When you have meiosis happening, look here, you start with a cell, you split in 2, and so that you could have eggs or sperm with a totally random set of alleles. Okay, so they separate it. One goes into each egg or each sperm. The law of independent assortment says, hey, those alleles of the different genes are totally independent of each other, meaning that in one egg, you could have the dominant allele to have freckles, and you could have the recessive allele to have attached earlobes. Okay, it doesn't not all the dominant ones go into one egg, and all the recessive ones go into another egg. It's totally mix and match and random, and it just happens, whatever happens to go left or right. And lastly, Mendel's law of dominance says that when there are 2 different alleles present, the dominant one is the one you're going to see. The recessive one is kind of hidden. So keep in mind, does that mean we never see recessive traits? No, we see them. But if there's a dominant one present, then you don't actually get to see that recessive trait. For example, go back to those pea seeds that we talked about at the beginning, Mendel's experiment. When he had the yellow seeds, they could be 2 dominant alleles. They could be a dominant allele and a recessive allele. But you're still going to see that yellow trait because that's the dominant color. If you have 2 recessive alleles, that's the only time you're actually going to see that recessive trait, the green phenotype, which is a word we'll use and define kind of later here. So keep in mind, Mendel basically figured out this idea of these genes have different versions of each other. He called them different factors. We're going to call that the different alleles of a gene. So each gene, for the most part, has different versions. That's why you can have brown hair, or blonde hair, or black hair, yada, yada. You can have, I'm trying to think, 6 fingers or 5 fingers, whatever. So those different versions of our genes can be dominant or recessive based on if they're going to be expressed or not. So if you think about what those words mean, dominant, recessive, let's look at some examples that are things you might actually see in yourself or in other people very frequently. So when we say dominant, we're talking about the trait that you actually observe, the one that is masking the other one, the one that you can see if you have it. If you have it, you're gonna see the dominant trait. So in the pea plant flowers, purple was the dominant color. Why? Because whether you had two dominant alleles or just one of them, you saw a purple flower. Even though he's got that little recessive one right there, doesn't count. Can't see it. It's there. He could pass it on to his babies, but you can't see a white flower. The only time you're going to see a recessive trait is if you only have recessive alleles. So look at this last flower again. Little b, little b. We use lowercase letters to represent recessive alleles because they're not as dominant and overpowering. So think of a big capital letter as a dominant trait and a little letter as a recessive trait. So both of these are different versions of the same gene. The gene is flower color. The allele could be purple, that's dominant, or white, that's recessive. So think about human beings. You might have seen a person with a chin like this. Okay, you might call it a butt chin, a cleft chin, and you might have seen people with nothing on their chin. Which one do you think is dominant? Butt chin? That's the dominant one. Doesn't mean everybody has it, just means that if you have the allele for it, you're going to have a cleft chin. Ooh, check out these people. Do you know what this is called right here when your hair points like that? It's called a widow's peak. Dominant? Recessive. That's a dominant trait. Do I have one? No? Don't think so. Does that mean it's super uncommon just because it's recessive? No, it just means that I didn't get that allele. I only have recessive alleles, that's why I don't have one. Ooh, do this with your thumb. Just stick your thumb up like that. Okay? Does it go straight up? Does it like bend back? I can't really do it. Bend. Okay? If it bends, it's called hitchhiker's thumb. Regular thumb's like this. A hitchhiker thumb is, I believe, if I remember this, the recessive trait. So once again, you could have it, you just don't have any dominant alleles to have a regular thumb. Okay, red hair. I don't actually think she's a natural redhead, but red hair is a recessive trait. Does that mean there's no red-haired people? No, it just means that you would need to have recessive alleles to have red hair. Ooh, check out that cat's hand. It's interesting. Or paw. Okay. Haters gonna say this is fake, but is it possible to have 6 fingers on your hand? Yeah, it's called polydactyl. Do you think that's dominant or recessive? That's a dominant trait to have 6 fingers on your hand. I've got 5 and 5. Does that mean that dominant is like super common? I don't know a lot of people with 6 fingers on a hand. Dominant just means that if I had the allele for it, I would see it. If I got the allele from my mom or my dad to have 6 fingers, then I would have 6 fingers. But I don't, because I only have recessive alleles, and that means that I only have 5 fingers on each hand. So recessive doesn't mean uncommon, it just means that it's going to be hidden if the dominant one is there. So keep some misconceptions in mind that you don't accidentally start accepting in your brain here. More common traits don't necessarily equate to better traits. Sometimes things are just more common in a population. Like if you think about the population of China, how they appear, what they look like compared to the population of America. They don't have a lot of people with deeper, darker skin tones. Doesn't mean that's better or worse. They just have a different kind of gene pool since they tend to marry other people in their country. Right? So cleft chin versus no cleft chin, having a widow's peak versus no widow's peak. These aren't better or worse, just dominant versus recessive here. Dimples, no dimples, brown hair, black hair versus blonde hair. Keep in mind, better doesn't mean more common doesn't mean dominant also does not mean more common. Did you ever see this show? It's called Little People, Big World. And what is up with this person and this person and this person? And I think that's it. They have dwarfism. They have a type of dwarfism called achondroplasia. That is a dominant trait. I personally don't know a lot of people with dwarfism. It's not that common. Why? Well, being dominant doesn't mean more common. Recessive doesn't mean rare. I have the recessive trait. I know you guys think I might be a dwarf, but I'm not. Okay? That just means that I have the recessive alleles. Does not mean that it's better or worse, doesn't mean that it's rare. Once again, that polydactyl, having an extra finger, it's a dominant trait, but it's not super common. It's not like we go to school and everybody's got 6 fingers. Most people have the recessive alleles. So to kind of end our session here, I want you guys to consider these words, consider the things we just talked about. And we're going to be using them again and again as we talk about genetics a little deeper. We are going to do Punnett squares. I hope you don't hate them. And if you do, I promise it will be okay. But keep these things in mind: homozygous, heterozygous, genotype, phenotype. And your job is going to be to answer the questions on the Google form and to be telling me what these words mean. So if you have any questions, shoot me an email, leave me a comment, and let me see if I can. And I will be hearing from you guys soon, and I hope you have an amazing day.